Which style of podcast is better, the interview or the solo host? So if we're thinking about a podcast, maybe we want to start a podcast or maybe we like to listen to them, and we're wondering, there seem to be lots of different types of podcast styles, but by far the two most popular are the interview style and the solo host style. And so with the interview style, it's really simple. Basically, the host is really there to ask questions and interview the guest. They tend to get guests that all have sort of a similar either benefit or similar industry or background, something about them to share with the audience that the audience is going to really like. And the interviewer's main job in that particular case is just to try to get the best amount of information and the most colorful stories out of the guest. So that way the audience benefits and really enjoys the episode. With the solo host style, it's a little bit different. It's sort of the style that I've normally done for the start of my podcast anyway, where we come up with a topic that maybe we're either an expert on or it's something that we have some familiarity with, and then we create an episode with some content based on that. It might be tips or it might be advice or experiences or stories or whatever. And basically the idea is to give people information that they can go ahead and use in whatever walk of life that our audience is in. So in my particular case, it's entrepreneurs. So anything that deals with the sort of personal development element of being an entrepreneur, along with the whole business element of building a business, marketing, sales, all of those kinds of things as well. And so the interview style podcast and the solo host podcast, they both have some distinct advantages and some distinct disadvantages. So it's not so much which one is better, but let's talk about what the advantages and disadvantages are of each and see how it fits within what we would want to do in the first place. So whether or not these advantages and disadvantages matter to us and whether they appeal to us or repel us are going to be things that are going to influence our decision about what style that we want to make. So it can also impact the success of a particular podcast because depending on what niche we're in and what audience we're trying to appeal to, we want to make sure that at the end of the day, it's all about the content that the audience is going to receive. It's got to be something that's informational, educational, entertaining, or hopefully all of that. So here's a little breakdown of sort of each. With the interview style podcast, the advantages are you get diverse perspectives. If I'm the only one on the camera and I'm the only one in the microphone, then the only perspective I'm able to share is my own or maybe stories that I've heard. But I don't have anybody else's firsthand accounts where they're going to be able to share anything that's going to be helpful for the rest of the audience. And so by interviewing different people, we can get different people with different perspectives. They might each all cover the same topic even, but what they're going to do is create a different set of tips, a different perspective, a different way of looking at all of those kinds of elements. So that way the audience gets the benefit of seeing each issue from multiple vantage points. So each episode can feature different guests, and that's going to bring in fresh viewpoints and expertise because everybody has a different background. And that will enrich the content and attract listeners. So in that one particular way, it's really nice in terms of the diversity of the actual perspectives. It's also going to provide networking opportunities. Anytime that we are interviewing other people, we are getting to know them. And even though we might be doing it for our show or for an episode, we are still getting to know the person. And because of that, we're developing a relationship. I know some of the interviews that I've done, I've gotten off the phone or gotten off the webcast or whatever and thought to myself, this is somebody that I would keep in my Rolodex and want to be able to stay in touch with because I think we can mutually benefit each other. So when we host various guests, it can expand our professional network and potentially lead to collaborations and other opportunities. So that's a really strong push and pull for why we would also want to do an interview style podcast. It's also best for audience growth. One of the biggest challenges that every new podcaster has is how do I get this show to grow? How do I get to a point where I have enough followers, I have enough listeners and downloads where I can, monetize this or grow it to a point where at least I feel like my time is being well spent. If you're recording episodes and you're getting 2 downloads, it's a little bit depressing to think, I did all that work for 2 people to hear it. But we can't think that way because the fact is, down the road, other people may go back and listen to that same episode. So for audience growth, we get to tap into our guest audiences. And so they're going to share the episodes that they're on with their followers. And when that happens, they're basically giving us their endorsement. And so that's going to increase the podcast reach and the listener base. It's also going to create really engaging content. Conversations with guests can be really dynamic and unpredictable. And so that can keep it really fresh. It can keep it really engaging. When it's just us and we have to talk all the time, then the challenge is, we have to do things to try to keep people engaged. We can try to be funny. We could offer a number of different tips. We could try cliffhangers and other things like that. But at the end of the day, it's still us, and it's always us, and it's always our perspective and our voice. When we have other people and we're playing off of each other, it keeps everybody engaged, and it allows also the host and the guest to think up other things that they might want to say because they're not always on the air. When a guest is talking and they come up with some ideas or they share some tips, it's easy to think about that, reflect on that, and then come up with a follow-up based on that. And so it builds on itself, and it can create for a little bit more natural, a little bit more authentic, and a little bit more sort of down-to-earth feel for a podcast. But despite the fact that there are some really great advantages with interview-style podcasts, there are also some real disadvantages. One of them is scheduling and coordination. Coordinating with guests can be really, really hard. And the more popular the guest is, the more desirable they are to be on your show, but they also are the harder to pin down, and they have less free time and ability to do it. And so logistically, even if you get an agreement in principle, it can be really difficult going back and forth just trying to get time scheduled to get a particular guest on the air. And this is especially true, as I mentioned, with anyone who is high profile. If they're high profile, they're in demand. So first of all, we're going to need a show with enough juice to get them to even want to come on it. If we have 6 downloads, it's not really going to be worth somebody's time if they're already a celebrity in their field to come on the show because they just aren't going to reach enough people that way. And so that can be a challenge there. It can be difficult to book good guests. If we are just starting out and we don't know what we're doing, we don't have a large following, a lot of guests might turn us away and say, look, I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's a great, that you're doing a podcast. It's just not the right fit for me. I'm in a position where they're not going to tell you this, but they're not going to spend the time or invest the time to go and meet and be on your show because it doesn't make sense for them. It's not out of disrespect. It's just out of the fact that they have limited hours in a day and they've got to choose how to use them. So it can be difficult to book guests, particularly good guests. There's also a dependency on guests, right? So if we're in an interview style podcast and that's really all we're doing, then we're on that escalator. We're on, that train left the station. So we've got to constantly be filling that schedule. And it's very difficult to do just-in-time episodes. So you're going to struggle to try to get 3 guests this week for episodes this week. If you're doing a weekly podcast, it's not quite as difficult because you only need 1 a week. But basically, you need to have your guests booked in advance. So if some cancel, if some drop out, if there's a problem, if things need to be rescheduled, you have enough content where you have enough that you can still be able to schedule. The great idea here is to actually do a bunch in advance and just don't air them right away. So that way, if you run into a problem with scheduling or you get sick or you have a week where you're on vacation or something like that, you have other episodes that you can fill in the gap if we have a back catalog that we can use to be able to tap into whenever we need it. The quality and the interest of the podcast also can become dependent on the guest. If the guest is doing most of the talking and the guest isn't really that engaging or knowledgeable, and it happens. I mean, you'd be surprised. You think, you're a guest on a podcast, obviously it's going to be just like a talk show that I see on TV. Those people are media trained. A lot of the people that we're dealing with when we bring people in, if they're an expert in their field or they're somebody who's already been on a lot, they're probably pretty savvy. But if it's somebody who's relatively new to the game, they may not understand. They might not know how to answer your questions well. They might answer too short, and then you have to keep prying additional information out of them. They might run on and on and on where you have to almost interrupt them. Otherwise, the entire podcast will be one question. And if they don't know a lot about a particular topic that we ask them about, it can be a little bit dodgy, because if people are listening to it, they might say, well, I disagree with that. I don't really think this person knows what they're talking about. And they might lose interest in the podcast, thinking it has no credibility. So it can absolutely affect the episode's quality and ultimately the reputation of the entire podcast. You also have less control over the content. I mean, we're dealing with human beings. So the very nature of it that makes it dynamic, exciting, and interesting is also the very thing that causes it to sometimes veer off course. You know, our guests are not responsible for making sure our audience benefits. We are. And so if they start talking and they go off on a tangent or start making political or religious statements, and that's antithetical to our podcast, I mean, we have the benefit of editing, but we need to sort of redirect things and get it back on track so people know basically what we're after. And that's a skill that we develop in time as an interviewer. So in the beginning, those kinds of people could steamroll you, and it becomes really challenging until we develop our interview chops and feel like we really know what we're doing. There also can be technical challenges. When you're recording in your own studio, your own bedroom, your own basement, whatever, it's very easy. You have control over the entire environment. So you can make things quiet, you can make good lighting, you can make sure the recording's working well, you can run tests. When you're on live with somebody and they're on spotty Wi-Fi, it's cutting in and out, it's hard. I mean, you know, a lot of the recording software nowadays is pretty sophisticated. It records independently on both users' computers and then merges it together. So that way, if their network connection is good, but it's struggling with the call, you don't lose quality of the actual call itself. However, there are still challenges. There are internet interruptions. There is downtime. Sometimes the network does go down, or the software app we're using to record does go down. And so that can be a problem. Other times it will record, but then the audio has some tinniness to it. They didn't test their microphone, so it's scratchy. It pops every time they talk into it. Again, these are issues that if it's someone who's savvy and been doing it enough, they probably have a setup where it works really well. But if it's somebody new in particular, they probably don't. And so those technical difficulties, we don't have those in solo recordings. So those are sort of the pros and cons, and you could see there's some real benefits. We don't need to come up with our own content. That's a huge selling point for interviews. We can look like an expert by tapping into experts right away. That's an advantage. But also, it's harder to get those kinds of guests, and the logistics are really hard. So let's flip the script and let's take a look at the solo host podcast advantages and disadvantages, because this has some as well. So from an advantage standpoint, we have complete control. We can shoot whatever episode we want about whatever topic we want. We can talk as long or as short as we want. We can do pretty much anything that we want. And so we have full control over the content, over the pacing, over the style. We can decide exactly what we want it to be. Our guest or our host is always the same because it's always us. And so we're going to have a consistent and a finely tuned output. Now, every podcaster, when they start, you know, their first few episodes, they're self-conscious about putting them out because they're not very good. But that is part of the game. That's part of the process. It's how we learn. So it's important to do them anyway. It's important to put them out anyway. And as long as we can laugh at ourselves, it's all good. There's also simplicity and flexibility. So when we're doing it ourselves, right, if we want to record in the middle of the night because our house is quiet and that's the best time to do it, we can go do it. If we have a guest on and they're from, you know, Bangladesh and we're in New York, we've got to find a time that works for both of us. And it might not be the time that's best for us in order to be able to accommodate the guest. And so it's harder to do the scheduling. When it's ourselves, we have the flexibility. We can record 2, 3, 4, 5 episodes in a day if we want, and then take the rest of the week off. We can record at night, record in the morning. We could do as many retakes as we want. We can test it as many times as we want. So it can be more straightforward and flexible. The editing is also a lot easier because we're only our own schedule. And it's only one video that we need to edit. We don't need to mesh anything together. We don't need to sync anything up. We have one video, we edit out the stuff that we don't want, and then we produce it. So it's that simple in terms of being able to get that created. Another advantage is personal branding. It allows the host to build a strong personal connection with the audience, which, by the way, is exactly why I started mine as a solo podcast. I felt like there are a lot of interview podcasts out there, but what do we know about the interviewer? I mean, are they an expert? Do they know anything about what they're talking about? I mean, or are they just somebody that interviews everybody? I wanted to make sure that my audience knew who I am, what I've done, where I come from, and what I know. And I wanted to share as many of the tips that I thought could help, because I feel like I have a lot of tips that can help in terms of being a mentor for people that I never had myself. And so we can make that personal connection with the audience. That enhances loyalty and it enhances recognition of our personal brand. You know, I was a guy that for a lot of years was sort of behind the scenes. I've been in the software industry for a long time, and I went to conferences and I did, affiliate marketing and things like that with a group of people, and we'd always be online on Skype. We get together occasionally at these events, but I never did a lot of stuff really publicly. I stayed off of social media, never really did any of that kind of stuff for various reasons. And I remember I was at one of the conferences and I was having a conversation with one of the other guys, and we had spent a large part of the weekend together. It was probably like the second night of the conference. We were at dinner again or something. We were talking about something, and he liked one of the comments I made or one of the insights that I had. And he said to me, and I'll never forget this, he said, Brett, you really need to step into the light. He's like, you're a guy that's sort of hidden, and you have all this information and all these ideas and tips, and you got a big heart, you want to help other people, but nobody even knows that because you're always behind the desk or whatever else. And thank you, Sterling, for that piece of advice. I've never forgotten it, and I didn't use it for a long time, but that was one of my impetuses to start the actual podcast itself, because I felt as though I want to share what I know to see if I can help people that are out there. It's also very cost effective if we do a solo, because we don't need as much equipment. We don't have as many logistical things. It's very simple. We can just have our own little microphone. If we're not even doing video, all we really need is a microphone and our laptop, and we can record from our closet if we want. We could also get a full rig, but we don't need it. The disadvantages of solo is the content creation pressure. It's a lot. It's hard to make new episodes all the time and focus on making them interesting, engaging, and everything else. All the responsibility for generating the content, and it needs to be interesting and engaging, rests on the host. We have to do it all. And it can be difficult sometimes to think up the right topics or figure out what we want to talk about and know that we're going to be able to provide value by doing it. So it can be really demanding and potentially lead to burnout. It's also a lot of work to record and produce and edit. So to sit on microphone and on camera for 30 straight minutes and talk is not an easy thing, particularly if we're not using a script. Now, if we're writing a script, it's a lot harder in the one sense because it's a lot more prep work. But then we're just reading off a script. But if we're ad-libbing and we're just using bullets or whatever else, it's a lot more challenging. And it's less prep work, but we have to be able to be engaged the entire time. The other challenge or drawback is that you get limited perspectives. I mean, without guests to provide various insights and expertise, we do lack a little bit of diversity. We can only reference what we know and people that we know, what they know. And that's about it. So we could alienate some listeners if they feel like, I've already seen and heard all that. The other problem we're going to have is audience growth. A lot of people want to focus on how do I grow my podcast? And that's the reason they gravitate toward an interview model, because when you're doing your own, attracting new listeners can be harder without the natural network effect that you get by having different guests and having them all promoting their appearances on what they're doing. There's also a risk of monotony. Keeping the format engaging over time can be challenging when it's the same thing all the time. Solo voice and perspective might become repetitive. So it's not always easy or clear decision about what type of podcast to start. The takeaway here is that ultimately the choice between an interview style and a solo host podcast will depend on our own goals, resources, skills, background, and experience, and obviously our audience preferences, because it's about them. Each format offers unique opportunities and challenges, so we need to pick the one that makes the most sense for us based on our personality, our preferences, and our ability to create value for listeners. There is no right or wrong with this, but there is a best option for each of us, or we could always choose a hybrid, which is ultimately what I've done. I started off as a solo. Now I'm doing more and more interviews, and the end result will be a hybrid where I'm doing some interviews and some solos. No matter what, it comes down to making great content for our audience and doing it in a way that resonates with us so it's fun to do.